Hello, everyone. Just so that you'll know, you are in Concurrent workshop. It's time for TANF to engage lived experience experts in more than just their case plan. I am James Butler, and I serve as one of the program specialists in the Office of Family Assistance, and I'm honored to be a moderator for today's session. We have a great panel of discussants planned for you today, so just sit back, relax, engage in the conversation, and we look forward to some of your feedback as we go along. So today we'll have before you Jessica Kendall, who serves as the Director at Family Services at ICF. Heather Newcomb, who is from the Employment and Career Services, who is the Employment and Career Services Coordinator at Vermont Works for Women. Along with Tony Vinson, who serves as the Workforce Development Specialist at DC Central Kitchen. Also, Emily Ramirez, who is one of the research analysts at ICF International. So welcome our panel, and without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn everything over to Jessica.
Thank you so much, James, and welcome everyone. As you can see, we've also welcomed you in the room chat, so I'd encourage you as you're listening and engaging in our conversation today, and I really do hope it's a conversation, to please post your thoughts, your questions, your reflections in the chat. We will have some time at the end to go through them and ask any questions of our panelists. Our hope today is a few things. We hope to share with you a little bit about literature and examples about how and in what disciplines we're seeing engagement of lived experience in human services, including TANF. We're hoping to hear from a panel of extraordinary experts, Tony, Heather, and Emily, about how to engage lived experience in program design and implementation. And importantly, we're hoping you're going to walk away with a few concrete ideas and strategies on how you can go back to your TANF program to increase what I hope is really authentic and meaningful engagement with individuals with lived experience. I want to introduce myself and my fellow panelists. Heather Newcomb coordinates employment and career services at the Vermont Works for Women. She passionately serves women experiences barriers to success in the workforce and plays a leading role at VWW programs for incarcerated women, both during incarceration and throughout their reentry. Heather has overcome many of the same barriers her clients face and brings that lived experience to her clients to ignite motivation and manifest hope. As a certified somatic life coach, she also helps women to discover their strengths and identify patterns of resistance that are blocking them from achieving their full potential and the power of choice. Tony Vinson is a workforce development specialist for the DC Central Kitchen, which is a nonprofit organization that fights poverty and hunger through job training and job creation in the food and hospitality industries. Tony first came to the kitchen in January of 2016 after serving his third prison sentence. As a child, he spent years in and out of foster care, and through his aunt's encouragement, he enrolled in the DC Central Kitchen's culinary job program. And after graduating, he was hired as a cook at the Hamilton, which for those of us who live in the DC area, know it as one of the fine dining restaurants in downtown. When he volunteered to help recruit participants to the kitchen's job training program, his natural ability to connect with potential applicants made him a top choice to become their full-time recruiter. And he has since become their workforce development specialist. Emily Ramirez is my colleague at ICF and a research analyst. At ICF, she supports various initiatives under the Office of Family Assistance to serve TANF programs, their staff, and clients. Prior to joining ICF, she served as a volunteer at the Los Angeles Community-Based Action Network, an organization run by and for individuals who've experienced homelessness and housing instability. She also served as a research fellow for Stanford's American Voices Project, which focused on the voices of lived experience experts with the aim of informing and improving public policy in marginalized communities. Her work, too, is grounded and driven by her own lived experiences with structural racism, economic inequality, and generational perseverance. And I'm Jessie Kendall. I also work at ICF. I work on a range of human service and victim service projects that touch issues of human trafficking, juvenile and criminal justice, TANF and workforce and education. For purposes of this session, I think the two projects I work on these days that are probably most relevant are I provide training and TA to federal offices at HHS on how best to engage lived experience experts in policy and program and evaluations. I'm also the lead facilitator and project director with the Department of State in their support of the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, which is a presidentially appointed council comprised entirely of human trafficking survivors who provide recommendations to the federal government on its anti-trafficking efforts. So we thought it was really important as we start this conversation today to make sure we're clear on what we're talking about. And the term lived experience might be one that's new to you. It might be that you've used the term TANF customer or former customer or client or even recipient or participant before. What we mean in this conversation today, and I hope you'll carry it with you into your work, when we speak about lived experience is exactly what's written on this slide. That what we're talking about are the experiences that people have had firsthand that touch a social issue or some combination of issues that had some direct impact on their lives. That they're drawing from that experience in the same way we might say professional experience or educational experience. There too is value in lived experience and bringing that to the fore, both in TANF and other human services. So when we say lived experience, what we mean is, again, the personal knowledge about the world gained through that direct, firsthand involvement in the systems and programs and services that we're talking about. So we're going to do a few polls today, and I'm going to try to navigate this tech as best as I can, but we really want to hear from you in different ways to make sure that, to be honest, our session is meeting your needs. Ooh, somebody's drawing all over it. That wasn't me, by the way. So I'm going to read this. Have you attended training before on how to engage lived experience in your programs? Yes or no? I'm going to make this poll somehow appear. So please take a moment and respond. And I see some of you have used the chat too, which is totally fine. All right, I'm going to end that quiz. So it looks like, while a few of you have attended a training such as this, the vast majority, over 80%, have not. So it's good. Welcome. Welcome to the conversation. How do I make those slides appear again? Let's see. Did it. I'm learning. So you guys might be familiar with this phrase. It's not an uncommon one. It speaks to the importance of inclusion and equity. It also speaks to the importance of self-determination and empowerment for individuals. But like I said, it's been around for a while. In fact, I did a little research, and some say that its origins lie in turn of the century Eastern Europe because it was a rallying cry for labor organizers. You might be more familiar with it more recently in the United States because it was and has been a slogan of the disability rights movement for years. And in fact, was used frequently leading up to the passage of the American Disabilities Act in the early 1990s. It is the foundation of our discussion today. And to be clear, today is not about telling one's personal story of success or challenge or barriers, or even divulging a difficult past to inform or inspire your work. It's also not about engaging TANF or other human service or even workforce customers in their case plans, as the title of this session suggests. Now, make no mistake, that is really important, right? To ensure services are targeted, that they're realistic, that they're actionable and maybe even hopefully empowering. But that's not what we're talking about here either. What we are talking about is to call upon you to go beyond meaningfully engaging customers in their case plans. We're asking them to share their stories to inform your work. Today's conversation is about more. As that slogan says, nothing about us without us. That's not about storytelling. That's about systems change and program change. It's about a seat at the table when programs are designed, when they're scaled, when you're tested or even evaluated. It's a seat at the table that you sit at when you draft policy or when laws are even written. So how did we get here? This slide in itself, I think, could probably be like a graduate level course. And I'm going to share it with you in like 2 minutes to say that there's been a long history of lived experience engagement in social services. And some would say that that began around 1912 with a seminal study that was done by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and its brand new Children's Bureau, when they did a study on infant mortality among immigrant and marginalized and impoverished urban communities. It was one of really the first studies that truly and meaningfully engaged study participants in the study to gather information for them and to inform the study itself. Fast forward to the mid-1960s, and many of you are familiar with the Head Start program and the genesis of that program. And from day one, at its foundation has been parent involvement. And that's been baked in to that program all along, parent engagement through advisory councils and committees, both at a national, state, and local level. Fast forward to the 1980s, where some of these principles around lived experience engagement start to come into the research world, where research used to look like that inverted triangle you see on the left, where sort of the hypotheses, ideas, the knowledge all came from academia and was pushed downwards, whereas today, through participatory action research principles, you see that knowledge gain and access and dissemination coming from many different sources, including lived experience, the people who actually touch the programs that are being researched. Another, I think, seminal point along this lived experience journey is a book by Roger Hart, and it relates to what he calls the ladder of participation. It's specific more to children in their youth in their engagement, to some extent in human services, but largely in civic engagement. But it provides a wonderful roadmap for what the different types of engagement can look like and the impacts of those engagement. As you can see from the ladder, those engagements that are bordering on manipulative to tokenizing all the way up to fully participatory, which of course is the goal. So why is this all important? If you aren't bought in already, I'm going to share briefly a few thoughts, but I really want to turn that question to Tony and Heather and Emily as well in a moment. Well, for the people with lived experience, it affords an opportunity, like I said before, for self-determination, for a sense of agency and empowerment. For the staff in your programs, it increases empathy and cultural understanding and of the community and accessibility needs and issues that the people that you serve are facing. And hopefully that translates into some programmatic impacts as well, where your program's more adaptable to the changing circumstances on the ground in the communities that you serve, that maybe you even move towards the different allocation of some resources and supports and services and the way that you provide them based on the feedback that you're getting from individuals who've been through it. So what does this look like today? There are a lot of examples in different human service disciplines of how lived experience expertise is engaged. I want to share 2 examples from other human service disciplines, but before I do, I want to ask you guys a question. And whoever drew on that poll, don't be drawing on the polls again. So this first question, has your TANF program engaged lived experience experts in policy, research, or program design? Yes or no? I'm going to make this poll up here. Let's see. Take a moment to respond. And if you're in the other please specify role, drop it in the chat. We'd love to see it. All right. Looks like things are slowing down. So this is like a 50-50. Like it looks like about half of you have engaged lived experience experts or individuals with lived experience in some form, whether in policy, research, or program design. That is great to hear. So my next question, this hopefully felt logical to you. So if you answered yes to the last one, in what ways have you engaged folks? Maybe as a consultant, folks on staff? Do you have some sort of advisory committee, trainers? And again, if there's other, please specify in the chat. So this is really interesting. So as a few are still responding, I got excited and started talking. We've got about a 38% response that you have people on staff with lived experience. About 29% have some sort of an advisory committee or body that includes to some extent individuals' lived experience. And then we've also got some trainers at 24%. And I see tribal council and elders in the chat. Interestingly, no one said that you've engaged individuals with lived experience as consultants. So we'll talk about that more in a bit. All right, last question for you guys. So what do you think are the biggest challenges to engaging lived experience in TANF programs? Fiscal resources, staff time, buy-in, concern over re-traumatization, or other? We're putting these polls to use. So it looks like we've got about over 50% of you that have noted one of the biggest challenges in this space is just time, staff time. Coming in second is staff leadership or buy-in to do it. Hopefully this session will help with that. We can also talk about time and resources. Both concerns over re-traumatization and fiscal resources are also potential challenges coming in at about 13% each. So we can address that as well. So I had mentioned that I was going to share 2 quick examples from other human service disciplines, just to give you a flavor for what this looks like elsewhere. This first example comes from the child welfare space. So again, child protection, foster care systems. And there's quite a bit of models actually in the child welfare space for lived experience engagement. This is just one of them coming out of North Carolina. In North Carolina, they've created a really strong infrastructure to have advisory councils made up of parents and youth that advise on various policies and practices in child welfare in the state. And they have, and I said they have a pretty strong infrastructure around it because they actually have a state advisory council. But then every county has its own family engagement council as well. And I don't know if there's anyone from North Carolina on the line or anyone that's familiar with the geography of North Carolina, but there's like 100 counties in North Carolina. So it's a really robust engagement effort going on there in terms of how they engage lived experience in child welfare. I wanted to share one other example, and this is in the housing sphere. Some of you might be familiar with the Continuum of Care grants that address youth homelessness. These are grants that come out of the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department. And many of those grantees also have advisory committees that are not entirely comprised of former homeless youth, but many have multiple members who sit on different ad hoc committees and provide really significant advising at a local level on reform policies, operations for shelters, that provide advice on ways to promote affordable housing, and importantly, best practices engaging with people with lived experience. For the remainder of our time, I'm going to turn it over to Tony and Heather and Emily for them to share their reflections and feedback and suggestions to you. And after that, we're going to sort of sum up and get you guys asking some questions. So please use the chat if you have them along the way. So I said before, I really wanted to ask our panel, Tony, Heather, and Emily, in particularly given the poll results around, needing leadership and staff buy-in for this. Tony, can you get us started? Why is this important? Why does TANF need to do this?
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Tony Vinson, recruitment specialist for DC Centric Kitchen's culinary job training program. With that said, why is this important? Let me even before I answer that question, I'm gonna kind of give you a little brief history of DC Centric Kitchen and kind of what we do there, that how we have individuals with lived experience, i.e. myself, as part of that staff and infrastructure on like what we do, from a day-to-day basis on our operations, as far as our, social enterprise all the way to our culinary job training program. So with that said, DC Centric Kitchen, if you don't know, is a nonprofit organization that's located in Washington, D.C. We've been around for 30 years. We've been training men and women in the culinary arts for probably the past 25 of those 30 years. The way that got kind of started was DC Centric Kitchen was kind of looked at as like a soup kitchen type situation. We fed individuals that were homeless. Actually, we still are located in the basement of a homeless shelter, the biggest homeless shelter in the nation, from what I hear. But with that said, we've been there for 25 years doing that, training men and women. But the way it got started was Robert Egger, who's our founder, like I said, was feeding individuals, in the building and things like that. But he also used to go out and do first helping, which was he would go onto the streets of DC, Southeast mostly, which is east of the river, where it's mostly poverty, away from all the politicians and the big, buildings and fancy stuff like that. That's why they call it east of the river, because it's mostly poverty over there. And that's, kind of how that got started, through all the slave thing. I don't know the whole history, but you guys can check your textbooks and figure that whole situation out. But going back to it, Robert Egger used to go to Southeast and, feed individuals that were homeless, didn't have food, just right there on the street corner, in front of corner stores, things like that. And what he found out after a couple of years is that these individuals were like looking for a handout, but needing things. They wanted something. They were looking for something better. So what he started doing was bringing them into his kitchen and having them cook for him, making these meals. And then he was what most of the things he was doing was bringing these meals from like different restaurants. And that was the thing. He was getting a lot of donations. So this wasn't like he wasn't going out purchasing food, things like that. He was kind of in the nightclub scene before he had started DC Centric Kitchen. So he knew a lot of restaurant owners and things like that. So he reached back out to those individuals when he started DC Centric Kitchen, would go collect food. So he was getting all his stuff off donations. So once after he was cooking these meals, bringing these individuals off the streets and helping cook these meals, he was reaching back out to these same restaurants and saying, hey, listen, I've been training this individual on how knife cuts and, how to temp food and things like that. Give him an opportunity to work in your restaurant. And that's organically how the culinary job training program got started. And basically what we do now is we have a 12-week job training program that operates Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30. And we train individuals in-house for 9 weeks. So they spend, the first 4 hours, in a classroom, and then the last 4 hours in a kitchen. And basically we're bringing up those soft skills just as much as those knife skills. And then week 9, they do all their finals. They'll do their serve safe, their aller train. And then we put them in an internship where they work within one of our DC Central Kitchen locations for a week. And then we put them in an externship where they work with a partner of ours in a restaurant for 2 weeks. And that either marries into a job, or we do, other means of work or of job searching and, work professional development, getting them, involved in, other interviews, things like that, to be able to bring them to some sort of employment. But our long-term goal is to get them a career. So we continue to work with them 2 years post-graduation and get them, into a career, which is what they did with me. I was working in a restaurant like Jessica stated, continuing to work with DC Central Kitchen. And then eventually I walked into a career. So with that said, that's the way DC Central Kitchen really engages individuals that come through our program with those lived experiences and put them, meticulously into sections of our organization where they can be beneficial. Like I said, these aren't just, individuals that's in, the dish pit or, cooking in the kitchen. These are individuals like myself who are, going out into the community. These are individuals that are alumni engagement specialists who are going out into restaurants and speaking with, sous chefs and executive chefs and talking to them about how, to bring in our students into their restaurant and why taking one of our graduates would be the best mean of employment for their establishment. And our partners know that these individuals come from broken homes, because the one thing that or broken lives, because the one thing that DC Central Kitchen does is we only work with individuals who have barriers to employment. So these are individuals that's coming from poverty, individuals that's coming from homelessness, individuals that's coming from addiction, individuals that's coming from incarceration. So all our partners know this coming in, and they're okay working with our students that have these lived experience, have these rough backgrounds, have these barriers to employment, but they know that they're getting the best product because they've been trained, they've been certified, and then they had practice in the field before they actually came to their restaurant. So with that said, DC Centric Kitchen does a lot of things. We have advisory boards. We have a CJT, which is our culinary job training program, which is we have an advisory council for that. That's mostly made up of individuals who have lived experiences, came through the program. But why this is important is because individuals need authenticity. Like they need somebody that's authentic, that's going to come in and get them the best services necessary. When this came out, when Jessica called me and asked me to be part of this panel, I have students that's in-house right now. Actually, we have 2 classes that's going on simultaneously. But I spoke with my group that's been in. They're about to hit internship at the time. Actually, they're in internship now. And I have 3 individuals that are currently on TANF or going through TANF at this current moment. And I gave them a couple questions, had them answer the questions, because I wanted to balance their questions off of what I know as lived experience and why I felt this was important. And then also, too, because I want to know if it's still going on and if their answers matched up with mine. And that was the one thing that all of them said was the issue that they had with their current TANF situation. And that was somebody that was authentic. Actually, it was weird because the one lady, when she answered it to me, it was funny because I thought she was, when she stated it, because I asked them, what's your biggest issue with TANF? If you could put something on it, what's your biggest issue? And when I was speaking to the girl, she said, they ain't got no experience. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? I was like, they got a bunch of young people out of college that, just started doing this. And she's like, no. they've been working in the field. They've been in there like 20 years. They ain't got no experience. They don't know what I've been through. They ain't got no experience. And I was like, oh, no street experience. Okay. And that's, and that's, you know, what all of them were connecting to. And that's, you know, the biggest thing that I came to realize when I was a kid. I wouldn't talk to anybody that didn't have, and this is, you know, a kid that's 6, 7, 8 years old. I ain't talked to nobody that I could tell, sizing them up, didn't have lived experience. If all your experience is behind a book, you couldn't get nothing out of me, and we weren't talking about anything. Same with my mother. So my mother went through the same thing. She didn't deal with anybody that didn't have lived experience, and it created for a rough situation where a lot of times we didn't even have TANF, or we weren't even in programs because she couldn't face some individuals because they weren't giving her the help that she needed. And that's the same situation that the individuals are dealing with now. A lot of our students aren't getting the assistance that they need because their staff member, their case manager, or their social worker, job coach, whoever's working with them, don't understand what it is they're going through. They hear what they're going through, but they don't understand. And that's why this is important. It's important on so many other levels, but that's the main reason is your clients, individuals coming through your programs want somebody that's authentic. And if you have 2 or 3 staff out of 50 that have lived experience, then that means only a small 2% of your clients coming through the program are going to get the benefits that they need or get the help that they need. And not to say that anybody that has book experience ain't going to be able to get individuals the help that they need. Don't get this crossed or twisted. But my main pitch on this is a large percentage of your staff should have lived experience in some aspect. Not to say that it should be a checkbox on their resume, but I would definitely put it in the job description. I mean, seriously, I mean, that's, you know, what this world is coming to nowadays. I mean, individuals want people that are authentic. And if you're not authentic and you can't help me in this situation because you don't know what I've been through, what are you here for? I'm going to kind of stop there. I don't want to go on a tangent, but because there's a lot of topics that we can touch, and I'll come back to some other things. But I'll turn it back to Jessica. See if we need anything.
Thank you, Tony. And as Tony's suggesting, you know, there's, even as his example shared through the kitchen, like there's a lot of different ways to do this, whether that's through staff or consulting, or you mentioned advisory committees. That's part of the how, but certainly you've driven home the why and the need for that authentic sort of engagement, that shared experience to increase rapport and trust. I want to be conscious of time because I want to get through a couple of these other questions, but Heather, anything that you would add to that? Why is this important for TANF to engage lived experience in their program design?
Well, I think it's important to engage lived experience, especially for folks that are really struggling to meet the expectations of the program. I mean, we all just have this natural desire to be good enough. And when you're working with a caseworker that doesn't understand your barriers, it's really hard for that caseworker to recommend, you know, solutions. So I think having that peer support with someone who has that lived experience is really important for, you know, overcoming some of those challenges. I think it's a little, you know, less judgmental. You know, if I set a goal with my caseworker and I wasn't able to achieve it, because there's that authority hierarchy, sometimes I felt judgment. Whereas if I was able to process that goal setting accountability with someone with lived experience, I'm less likely to feel that judgment. So I think, you know, just setting up that relationship, building that trust, and understanding that the person you're working with was in your shoes at one point really goes a long way. And then fold in that caseworker that has the expertise of the system and the benefits is another good reason why this is important.
Emily, anything that you'd like to add to?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I would add that I think talking to people is one of the key things that makes TANF programs adaptable or adaptive to change in real time. So I think people are ahead of research. They often are. So what I mean is people know what is changing and what's going on and what needs to be changed in TANF programs before the research will put out an article that says it. So 10 years ago when I was 15 and me and my mom were navigating these systems, like I observed and my mom observed that it wasn't enough to just place her in a job. That didn't make us stable in the way that we needed it. Like she needed additional supports, behavioral supports. And later we see articles talking about, you know, how work should come last and work should last and should create financial stability and promotional pathways, not just placing people in a job first. And I think when you talk to people, you're able to get these insights in real time. And I think to do that, we have to break away from the hierarchy that Jesse talked about earlier, where academia is the most valued and lived experience is at the bottom. Like we need to value it all equally. And I would argue sometimes lived experience has more weight than academic experience.
And Tony, you raised a point which I see folks are responding to in the chat, and I think it kind of talks to this next question. So maybe you can take this one first as well, around what are some of the ways that TANF programs can engage people with lived experience, again, in their program design or policies. Like one thing that you talked about was you're bringing people on staff and actually in those job requisitions, giving some weight to lived experience in the same way we do, Emily, to your point, to professional experience or educational experience. So Tony, any other ways, you know, functional ways that TANF programs can engage people with lived experience?
Sorry, you kind of cut out there at the end. I don't know if that was my feed or your feed, but I'll piggyback on that because in program design, our policies, like, you know, I was speaking on with the putting it on the job description. I mean, that's obviously one step, but you know, there's all types of levels, you know, like you said, advisory boards, things like that, to be able to engage individuals, like even individuals that's like, you know, already caseworkers that like maybe don't have the lived experiences, like getting some sort of like, you know, job coach or, you know, consultant, like you were stating before, that they don't have consultants, like somebody that could work underneath that individual that has the lived experience, maybe at a lesser salary, things like that, to be able to work with those individuals, to be able to get that feedback that's necessary, and then translate that to the you know, the individual that doesn't have the lived experience that can start to move the you know, pawn pieces. So I mean, those are just some small ways to start implementing that. But like, I think overall, like I said, if your majority of your staff is made up of individuals that don't have the lived experience, you might want to just, you know, consider looking at that a little bit, because you know, like Emily was stating, sometimes that lived experience is a little bit more important than individuals who have the educational experience. And like I said, it's just because your biggest thing about TANF is connecting with the clients. And that's the easiest way to connect with a client. The reason like I said, the reason Jessica has stated it, the reason I've been successful in my position, and, you know, the reason they even considered me for it was because of the feedback that I was receiving behind the fact of my lived experience. Because every individual site that I went to, whether it be an inpatient drug treatment program, whether it be the actual jails, whether it be the halfway houses, the men's shelters, I've been to all those places. So when I go in and I speak to these individuals and they hear this and they're like, oh my God, like when you walked in and you were in the suit and tie, we would have never thought in a million years that you had ever had, you know, 6 felonies on your record, or, you know, the things that I had been through. And it's like, you know, but to hear that and to see where I'm at now and know that DC Centric Kitchen was the reason that I was able to make this transition, the same as if you were giving this presentation to an individual who was on TANF and they were talking to you, then they're going to think, I'm going to be successful in this program now because this individual knows what I've been through, and they're going to be able to help me in every step of the way. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get back on to why this is important, but I can't stay away from it. But this is the reason it needs to be implemented. So figuring out ways to get that program design implemented with individuals who have that lived experience is very important.
Emily, anything that you would add with respect to ways that the folks on the line can do this?
Yeah, I would add that, like Tony was saying with the reference to advisory committee boards, I think it's important to think through systemic ways to get people involved. So regular, consistent ways that are thoughtful about avoiding subconscious bias to choose people who might be telling you that your program is working great, because I think we all want to hear that. And when you only have like 1 or 2 or 3 staff who decide who gets reached out to, who do we interview, who gets the surveys, there's a subconscious and sometimes conscious tendency to pick people that are going to tell you, there's nothing wrong. And that's how we get the constant display of success stories. But I think we really it's important to look for people who have critiques, who might be frustrated, who might tell you that A, B, and C aren't working. And then I think it's also important to compensate people for their labor, because this is time that they're taking where they could be at work, or they might have to figure out childcare, they might have to figure out transportation. And so fairly compensating them, anticipating and being prepared to provide them with the supports that they need, whether that's, again, transportation, childcare, a stipend, whatever it may be. That's one way I think that people can be thoughtfully engaged and not just provide labor that gets extracted.
And I think you're beginning to touch on some of the other questions that we have coming up. And to some extent, Tony, I think you did too, because underlying any of these engagements is a need to be strength-based and trauma-informed in sort of the way in which that engagement occurs. So that, as we asked earlier, what is one of the challenges? Certainly you don't want to create a situation in these engagements where it's potentially re-exploitive in some way. Heather, any suggestions you have about, again, ways that TANF programs can engage people with lived experience?
I think there are a lot of diverse ways. I was thinking about this, and I'm thinking, integrating people with lived experience for orientations, for people who are, applying for benefits for the first time. People who have been on benefits for a while have really good advice for efficient ways of using benefits, or preparing them for the potential gaps that they should consider. I remember one time, as I was transitioning off and I no longer had food stamps, my grocery bill was the only line item that I really had control over. So if my son had $5 field trip fee for school, it came out of my grocery money. And it was other women who had been through this that advised me, other community resources I could go to when I no longer qualified for benefits. They helped me prepare for that eligibility, or that benefits cliff that is very common in this field. So understanding how, that lived experience can really provide that information for new people coming on to benefits, and really expand the awareness of the system limitations and the missed opportunities. TANF is just that, temporary aid to needy families. And, the purpose is for them to transition off. And when you see generational poverty, those patterns are really deeply ingrained. And so having that peer support, that advice to go to, and how to successfully transition off is really important.
And I think you're actually beginning to answer my next question, which I was going to ask you first anyway, in terms of just when we think about sort of the trajectory of a TANF case from, when you first walk in the door for orientation and eligibility, and maybe you're engaging in some job search, there's some ongoing case management, et cetera. What topics, what experiences in that chronology feel most ripe for some advising, some consultation, some recommendations from lived experience experts? Like you just mentioned, that orientation session, and having someone with lived experience there to help co-facilitate or co-train or to support that engagement. Are there other things like that, Heather, that you would suggest along that TANF trajectory that would really benefit from a lived experience expert's advice and support?
I think understanding, engagement, motivation, and the mindset of the clients. It's not just as important to get buy-in from staff and leadership, but getting the buy-in from, the clients receiving benefits to see their caseworker as a teammate and not a gatekeeper. Building or providing support and assistance for building that relationship and gaining that trust with folks who receive benefits. Also to, gain awareness for, understanding scarcity and how the system itself perpetuates that. Many folks, find security in benefits until they learn, the opportunities of employment. And I make much more now working in a career that I love than I ever gained, when I was on public assistance. And giving back and that reciprocity, does build, not only that self-determination and, agency, but it also builds my self-worth. Like, I'm too expensive for TANF now, to be honest. And it feels good to say that. So I think, when I think about different topics, I think, incorporating folks with lived experience and staff onboarding and training so that they understand the mindset of scarcity and poverty and gain that understanding of resistance to really focus on the strengths and opportunities rather than the restrictions and limitations of the system.
Wonderfully said, Heather. Emily, anything you would want to add to that, again, on different aspects of the TANF experience that are really ripe and important for lived experience advising?
I think on this one, Heather really covered it all, so I'll just defer and, what she said resonates.
I see Tony, you want to add anything?
I'm with Emily. I mean, I can't follow that.
Heather,
she's right. That warm handoff, or what she was speaking on before too was, that warm handoff, like that drop off, like when you're about to be off the benefits, and I think that should be a topic of, focus for lived experience engagements for real, because we do deal with that a lot, and that's the reason, we work with individuals that's on TANF. That's why I go to, TANF, information sessions and things like that to speak with the women, because they're getting closer, to that point of that handoff, and we want to be able to get into a financially stable situation before that, situation happens. So like Heather said, there isn't that drop off where like all of a sudden you're just like, okay, what do I do now? So yeah, no, that's definitely like a point of focus. But yeah.
So Emily, maybe you can start this next one. And deeply important to doing this effectively and meaningfully. And it was an area of potential challenge or concern, as we saw earlier. So if folks are doing this to some extent, in fact, about 50% of you said that you're doing some engagement, like how folks that isn't, again, potentially exploitive, tokenizing. What are some tips that you have about ensuring that this type of engagement, when we're engaging in policy, can be trauma-informed?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And so tokenizing, aka making only symbolic efforts to seem inclusive to minority groups, I think can happen. We can break it down into two different categories. Like it can happen on the staff side and it can happen on the current and former TANF customer side. So on the staff side, I think a lot of organizations are focused on representation. So in TANF programs, people want their employees to be representative of the communities they serve. So I think there's the effort to recruit people who might be racially, ethnically, or just via their experience with poverty diverse. But if it stops there, then we risk tokenizing those people. I think that the effort needs to be carried all the way through. And so on the staff side, I think that means giving people the power to have a say in decision making when it comes to policy and program design. And that might mean that somebody doesn't have like a graduate degree, but they do have the lived experience. So it just kind of goes back to what we're saying about valuing that and giving them a seat at the table. And then on the current and former TANF customer side, where they might be going through the program or providing feedback after they've gone through the program, I think shared decision-making overlaps, so they should have a say in program design and implementation. Again, I would say that compensation is a huge part of not tokenizing people, so that it's not just, hey, give us your feedback and we're gonna publish this in an article or a summary of our meeting, but it's not really gonna have any change. Like, I think compensating people for their time, and a really important thing I think is not writing things off as outside of the scope of what an organization can currently do. And I think the pandemic has shown us how things that might seem impossible are possible, and we just need to shift our mindset and like ground ourselves in what people need rather than what we think can be accomplished within the box of like red tape that we have. So for example, 4 years ago, if you would have asked a mom who doesn't have a car and has like 2 children and is trying to navigate getting a job, like what might make navigating TANF easier, she very well might have said, being able to have phone interviews rather than go in person would make my life a lot easier. But I think a lot of programs would have had pushback, like, that's just not the way we do things. Like, you need to come in person for orientation. You need to come in person to meet with your caseworker. And the pandemic has shown us that that was an arbitrary rule, and that we can be productive in telehealth appointments and telesocial services. So I think taking the momentum that we have right now and coupling it with using the testimony of people as a compass to achieve our purpose is really what's going to give us that authentic partnership with people, and not tokenize what they need and what they're willing to share with us to like improve programs.
Tony, anything you would add? What are some important takeaways folks should have about being trauma informed in this engagement? Not tokenized.
Sorry, I was trying to see something else. So no, just being I mean, how can TANF programs be more trauma informed? I mean, I really think like just you know, like just making it be present, like, because I mean, mostly everybody that's like going through, you know, TANF or, you know, is coming through that system, it has you know, it's their life has been turned upside down in some aspects, so there's trauma all over the place. And what I mean is, by just making sure it's present, is not letting that fall off the table. So whatever means is necessary to be able to get those individuals the help that they need should be the forefront focus, because one of the biggest, you know, the way I'm gonna relate that is one of the biggest things that we do at DC Centric Kitchen is, and the reason I believe I was successful is we didn't just have culinary training, or we just wasn't doing serve safe and getting certifications in the culinary field like Aller training, things like that. The very first class we went to in the morning was self-empowerment, and being empowered within self is one of the biggest things that you can do to overcome whatever situation you've been through. And with that said, I was, you know, broken in every aspect, but a lot of people, when they looked at me, just seen a criminal, because I had been to prison 3 times. I got 6 felonies on my record. But all this started from when I was 6 years old and my mother put me in a foster home. And that started that whole cycle, because I, over the course of time, was looking to be accepted. So when I started beating people up and like I was getting other people on the side to give me claps and rounds of applause, I was being accepted. When I started selling drugs and people were coming to me wanting to need things, I was feeling accepted. But when I got into that self-empowerment class and I realized that I was tearing myself up, I was ruining my future, I was destroying myself behind something somebody else did to me, and I was a victim, and I was able to look at that and understand self. This is what I mean by being trauma informed. Like, your staff need to be able to recognize this as much as get that individual the help that they need, because they might not speak to you or say that right out the gate, especially if you don't have lived experience. So with that said, just being able to be informed of what that trauma looks like from the beginning, getting the staff the training that they need to be able to recognize that, is going to change that individual's life. Seriously. And like I said, the reason we're successful is because we put that on the table immediately right out the gate, so students don't have an opportunity. You're gonna put that out there. You're gonna tell your story, and we're gonna rebuild you back up from scratch. And that's why, when we do our graduations, all the students talk about is self-empowerment. If they didn't have that, they wouldn't be the individuals that they are today. And that's because we're trauma informed. We know that individuals coming through our program are coming from, broken homes, jails, institutions, addiction, depression, post-traumatic stress, all these things that, have been traumatic in their life, and they just want the help. And if the help is there in front of them and they know individuals are there to support them in that help, then they're going to go through with it. And that's what I mean by being trauma informed. If your staff know what to look for and they know those keys, and then you open that door up with that individual because you open that door, even if you don't have lived experience, your clients are going to have respect for that staff member. And that's I hope that answered your question, Jessica. I'm sorry.
It does. And Tony, you've actually touched on like the foundational principles of what trauma-informed practice is, right? You can't be trauma-informed if you don't understand what trauma is. You can't be trauma-informed if you aren't in a position to be able to recognize it and respond to it. And I don't mean by treating people in some sort of medical way for trauma, but being able to truly just be able to recognize and respond appropriately, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And Emily, you raised some really important points as well. And I see some folks responding in the chat about them. And importantly, about and putting value in real financial resources, behind this engagement in a way that is self-empowering, right? And I would just add to that compensation is broad. It's not just about maybe paying someone for that time, whether it's because they participated in a focus group, or they sit in an advisory committee, or they've conducted a training for you, or even responded to a survey. But to the extent that you're asking for more of their time or more in-depth time, compensation isn't necessarily just that paycheck. It also can be that support to get them into the meeting in the first place. Whether that relates to transportation or childcare or other needs that an individual might have in order to effectively engage. So this might be trending into my next and final question, which Heather, I'm hoping that you'll tackle. Give us some how. How can the folks on the line do this? And I think we're looking for some advice around things that they might need inside their programs in terms of infrastructure in order to do as well.
Yeah, I think, making sure that there is transparency is really important when you're looking at incorporating aspects of lived experience, whether it's a staff position or, making a place for the peer support or the advisory council. I think of a coaching model, so whether, a caseworker is working with a client who might be dealing with a lot of conciliations or sanctions, bringing in a person from, that's experienced that and maybe turned it around could be really helpful. Bringing in someone with lived experience, maybe to ask some of those tough questions about, what's getting in the way. If I had to disclose a relapse or something like that, I don't want to disclose it to a caseworker who might then, put me on notice for my benefits. I think in terms of, program or system structure, look at creative ways for folks to fulfill activity requirements. So if there's a work requirement, can they volunteer as a peer support person for TANF recipients, and the time that they put in fulfills their work requirement? Integrating professional developments for them and counting that as activities. I think there's a lot of ways that TANF can incorporate it, although it's really important that it's not a success-only journey, and make sure that, there's understanding that clients aren't going to have it all figured out on the first go around. There's going to be lots of mistakes, and having that empathy and that flexibility to say, you know what, we are going to work on this and we're going to overcome this. This is just the next goal that goes on to our to-do list.
So I've seen quite a few questions come in on the chat. I'm going to move to the next slide or two so we can make sure that we have time for them. So in many ways, these next two slides sort of sum up, I think, all the great advice and suggestions that Tony and Heather and Emily have shared already. When thinking about the types of engagements that you might employ to access all the expertise that comes to bear with lived experience, here are a few examples, and they come from the examples that Tony and Heather have shared, as well as other human service disciplines. And so we've talked about several of these already. You know, are you looking, when you're hiring new people, are you looking for both professional, educational, and lived experience? How are you weighing those when you are interviewing people or even putting out those job postings? How are you engaging individuals' lived experience in some of your trainings for staff? I saw one of the comments in the chat from someone that mentioned focus groups at a state level, but it wasn't, that kind of level of engagement wasn't coming down to the counties or the local level. What kind of training are you offering at your county level, and who's conducting those trainings? Do you have anyone who's been through the program supporting staff training on how to do this work? We've also touched upon advisory panels, advisory committees. It's a wonderful way to have a larger cross-section of individuals who are advising. That might increase diversity too, because you get a lot of different viewpoints and pieces of advice. And we've talked about consultants. You know, in the same way that your organization might hire a consultant to support you in some aspect of your program, why can't lived experience experts also consult your program in different ways, or at those different touch points that Heather spoke about? I will say some of these engagement types are more short-lived, right? So that you might have, in terms of resources, it might require less staff time and support and resources to do them. And as such, you might actually be able to touch that many more people. So you have much more diversity in terms of the different viewpoints you're gathering. Some of them are a little bit more long-term, right? A little more intensive, like a consultant or a trainer, where that it's harder to get that diversity, right? Because you're probably only hiring a couple people. Anything that the panelists, Tony, Heather, or Emily, you would want to add to that?
I'm good.
Let me see. You guys also talked a lot about, you didn't always use the term, but you talked a lot about authentic engagement and meaningful engagement and having that shared experience. And in many ways that, whoever's drawing again, in many ways that really touches on being trauma-informed. Here are a couple principles that in any of those engagements, whether they're short-lived or long or anywhere in between, we'd encourage you to ensure. Certainly aspects of, I won't touch on all of these, but certainly aspects of transparency. What is the engagement? What are you as the program hoping to get out of it? And being clear about that with the person that you're engaging. And being honest about what the limitations of that engagement are. So if, for example, you're wanting feedback on policy or even law, you know, what's the parameters around that? You know, would it require, for example, the suggestions that are being offered an act of Congress to change something? So being clear on what those limitations are for the individual you're engaging so that they know how to tailor their support and recommendations in a way that's realistic and, to be honest, mutually useful for you and them. Allow for choice in these engagements. Even the smallest thing, from setting an agenda to a meeting or where you're going to meet or how, to the bigger stuff, like what they're going to be advising on you and letting them draw upon the skills, whether it's professional or personal, that they want to draw on to give you that advice. And Emily talked about this before. Actually, everyone talked about empowerment. A part of that is fairly compensating people for their contributions, not holding someone who has that academic or professional experience in higher regard than somebody who has the lived experience. So when we were prepping for today's conversation, Tony, Heather, Emily, and I were chatting about if we wanted to leave you with just a couple ideas, things we would suggest that you do when you go back, not back, you're already there, but virtually go back to work. What would we suggest to get started, if you haven't already, in engaging people with lived experience? And what you're seeing in that kind of grayish brown box is Tony, Heather, and Emily's suggestions. Think about ways that you can survey current or former TANF customers about their experience. How was it? How could it be better? And then use that information to make change, program or policy change. You might be working with other community-based organizations, maybe it's workforce, education, that are doing this. Somebody just loves drawing on this. So they might be partnering with lived experience experts in different ways. See how they're doing it, engage with them too. Learn from them. And as I think was mentioned before, and I know folks were like, oh yes, let's do that in the chat. Think about how you post for jobs. What qualifications are you asking for? What are you showing value towards? And how can lived experience be one of those things that you show value? Before we open it up for questions, Emily or Heather, Tony, any last thoughts about that?
I have one. For the last one, including lived experience and job requisitions, I would add that I think there's a lot of important research being done about how white supremacy is oftentimes embedded in corporate culture. And I think understanding that will help future employers disentangle that and kind of figure out what are the arbitrary norms of like corporate culture that are actually harmful to people who might not fit the normal, they might be diverse in all of the ways that diversity can be defined. And so how can we not just recruit, again, diverse people, but support them in upward trajectories throughout their entire careers?
We've had a few questions come in, so we're gonna see how many we can get. Heather, this first one was for you. You mentioned including lived experience experts into orientations. What are your thoughts about engaging lived experience experts for cohort groups or mentorships or as partners to support and share information during that process?
I actually think that's a great idea, and I really encourage incorporating folks with lived experience, throughout someone's time on TANF. I know when I was working at a group site for my work requirement, often many of us would have lunch together so that we could really group problem solve some of the issues we were running into, such as balancing public transportation and the fact that, daycare or the after school program didn't run late enough for me to be able to fit my full 30-hour work requirement in because of how long public transportation was. And so I could, have a group of other people that were dealing with the same limitations and restrictions, and we could support each other so that, one day, my neighbor picked the kids up after school and she left early and I got to work late and she fed the kids and I picked my son up after supper so I could end up, working my full work requirement and get off of sanction. I think there's lots of ways that, especially in single parent households, that we just have to build up those support networks. And I think, one great place to start is with folks who are in the same situation as you are.
Thank you, Heather. So this next question comes in, it's sort of a biggie. So I'll let whomever wants to try to tackle it in like 2 minutes to tackle it. Well, it's both a comment and a question. And is it, we're all broken is what it says. I wonder if there are ways that people with more quote unquote book experience than lived experience could consider ways of leading with their own brokenness that would enable them to relate more strongly with others. What are your guys' thoughts?
I think that's a great idea. When I think about, poverty, I liken the term to scarcity, because even though not everybody has experienced poverty in their life, at one time or another, they may have experienced scarcity in some form or another. So I think of ways to kind of, use other terms. I work with incarcerated individuals a lot, and I don't see it as crime. I see it as harm. And, not all of us may have committed crimes, but many of us have inflicted harm. And so it just kind of levels the playing field, and it puts it in terms that are more, common.
Tony, this next question is for you. And you had mentioned the self-empowerment programming that was so helpful at the DC Central Kitchen. And the question is, do you think that TANF really holds similar self-empowerment program, or should it be just outside of TANF?
Yeah, I had responded back to Michaela, I think, who that was, but I will say it out loud so everybody can hear. I believe wholeheartedly you can implement that sort of situation, not outside of TANF hours or situations. One of the things I recommended is they could start it as a volunteer basis, like kind of post, put in most of the lobbies, you have, flyers and things up for like different jobs and things like that, post up a thing and, state that you're about to have self-empowerment classes and things like that, and see how many people get involved. And, it could start out as a once a week for 1 hour type situation that you have 10 people that end up blowing up into something you're doing, once a day for the next, 40 weeks. And you got 30 people involved. It's seriously like it's all about the same thing with the putting out surveys. If you guys put out these surveys and you really want to capitalize on some of the answers, like you really need to implement change behind these answers. And it'd be the same with this. If you post out those, volunteer sheets saying that, you're doing these sort of classes, you're going to get individuals that's involved. And, you don't have to tokenize or have some sort of buy-in. It's just more so in the sense that like you're putting that out there for those individuals to who want that change. And once you get these sessions going and the word gets out there, word travels fast, it'll be successful. I can guarantee you. And this is one of the things, stating that, you can have somebody that has lived experience teaching, because these are individuals that are going to have that, sort of delivery that your clients are going to want to hear, you know what I mean? And they'll be coachable and receptible for whatever information is given out. And this could be a way that you can, handle both situations, bring individuals in, and individuals who have that lived experience that are coming off TANF, give them an opportunity to be successful and give back as well too.
Well, with probably about 30 seconds to spare, we have a few verses. I believe these slides will be available to you. And I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to Tony and Heather and Emily for sharing your insights and your recommendations and your strategies. I hope everyone took away a few concrete ideas of things that you can do whether you're at a state level or local or otherwise, you can do to increase engagement with the people with whom you serve. Again, and that be their case plans, that it be in the way that you design and deliver your program, you write and implement your policies, and even the way that you enact your laws. Thank you guys so much for your time, and have a good evening, afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your afternoon and evening.